Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kristopher Smith. He's a postdoc in the Human Sociality Lab in the Department of Anthropology at Washington State University, where he studies long-distance relationships and natural resource management in Tanzania in collaboration with Pisor and Monique Borgerhoff Mulder. This project applies evolutionary anthropology to better understand how communities can work together to manage shared open access fisheries. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that and other aspects of Dr. Smith's work. So, Dr. Smith, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk with you.
Great. So let's start perhaps with the general question. So what are the aspects of human sociality that interest you the most and the ones that you tend to focus on the most in your studies?
Yeah, so what I'm interested in is the psychology of cooperative relationships. So humans, unlike the great apes and many other animals, form a wide variety of different kinds of relationships, where most non-human animals might only have relationships with kin or some what you might call friends in some primate species. Humans will form a vast array of different kinds of relationships, and these relationships are really supported by this complex psychology that helps us navigate finding, attracting, and maintaining relationships with valuable social partners. So I'm really interested in that aspect of human sociality, but in particular, I'm interested in how evolution and cultural processes shape this psychology. And so how does this psychology vary across ecological and institutional contexts?
Mm-hmm. So from an evolutionary perspective, I think is the best approach to studying human cooperation because, I mean, according to the answer you just gave us, it seems to me that it's not only looking at the biological aspects of it, but also at the cultural ones, correct?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, humans are a cultural species, and I think there's a lot of work to suggest that culture is going to play a major role in how humans cooperate. I think what I would say is that when I first started graduate school and started doing research, I was really interested in the question of the evolution of cooperation, right? So how did humans evolve to cooperate? And I used to think, we're trying to find the best model or the best theory to explain human cooperation. And I think I've grown to the position where I think the more appropriate question is, in what context, in what populations do different mechanisms to maintain cooperation work? And especially if we start thinking about how are we going to apply these principles, we want to be thinking about how cooperation works in this particular context. So for example, there are tons of models or explanations to try to explain how humans cooperate, things like kin selection, so people cooperate with family members because they share genes, reciprocity, I help you because you help me, reputation or partner choice models where people help each other to build a better reputation of being a cooperator and attract better cooperators themselves, all sorts of different kinds of models. And I think what you can find is you'll find evidence for these models to varying extents in many different kinds of populations. So I think the more appropriate question, or the way I like to think about my research, is trying to figure out which cooperative mechanism is at work in this particular context.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to studying particular traditional societies, hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, and others, for you, for example, who is interested in studying human cooperation, is it the reason why you chose to study people from Tanzania or the Hadza, for example? Is it related to the fact that you wanted to study human cooperation and you think that those are especially good models for understanding how we evolved our ways of cooperating, or is it for any other reason that is unrelated to what I just said?
Yeah, so I'd say this is also something I've grown on. So when I first started graduate school and the reason I decided to work with my PhD advisor, Coren Apicella, was because she was working in Hadza, and I was interested in hunter-gatherers because they're often discussed as models of human evolution. I think it's important to point out that, of course, what can often be confused is these aren't, the Hadza aren't fossils. They're not, they differ wildly from ancestral hunter-gatherers in many ways that we probably don't even know. So I don't want to frame my work as, I'm studying hunter-gatherers, so I'm studying cooperation in the way that humans might have done it ancestrally per se, but we do know foraging played a major role ancestrally among humans. Hadza have less exposure to institutions associated with agriculture that might affect how we cooperate. In particular, though, I was really interested in the questions of partner choice models of cooperation. So the idea that people can compete to be seen as more cooperative partners. And the reason the Hadza, I think, is a good context to study that in, or it's an interesting one at least, is because they live in this sort of fission-fusion sort of social structure. So they live in these bands that we call camps. About 20 to 30 people live in them at a time. And these camps will move locations as resources are used up in the local environment. But more importantly, people can move between these camps freely. So it's not as if these camps are stable social units. People will come and go as they please. And beyond that, they're also really cooperative within these camps. So they have widespread food sharing norms. So meat in particular, but food that's brought back to the camp is usually shared with most other members of the camp. And so there's a real risk to being exploited in these camps. They're highly interdependent with each other. Mm-hmm. And so as they're moving, they have to be choosing, or presumably they have to be choosing good cooperative partners. So who are the best campmates to live with? Because it has real consequences for them and their lives. So I thought partner choice models would be an interesting research question within that particular context.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I've asked you that question specifically. I've been asking it a lot recently to anthropologists specifically because there's this issue in anthropology and also somewhat in evolutionary psychology about, okay, so we're studying contemporary or modern hunter-gatherers in this case, but they are not necessarily representative of the societies we evolved in for ecological reasons, whatever. So I was just wondering if by studying these societies like the Hadza and societies in Tanzania, you are really trying to get at good models of what might have been the kinds of societies we evolved in, or are you just trying to understand how human cooperation works in particular contexts, like for example, taking into account the ecological conditions they live in, and it's not necessarily that you're making claims about, okay, so these were the kinds of societies we evolved in and these were the evolutionary pressures we were exposed to, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You're right. It's a very important issue anthropologists have been wrestling with, I think, for a long time, but recently there's been a lot of attention to it. Again, I think early on in my research, I did think of it as the latter. That is, I'm studying hunter-gatherers, and this will give us insight to how humans cooperated in the past. I think the issue is we don't quite know exactly how they differ between ancestral and modern contemporary hunter-gatherers. The very things we're interested in, behavior, institutions, culture, tend not to leave fossilized evidence. So it's hard to tell exactly how different they are. I think it's safe to say that, because they're largely full-time foragers, they're probably more similar than, say, you or I living in the city. But I think it's a totally different question from, well, how similar are they really to ancestral hunter-gatherers in such a way? So more recently, I have been thinking more about my work in terms of understanding in this particular context, in these situations, when we have widespread food sharing, how does that affect how humans cooperate, how we choose our cooperative partners and things like that?
So tell us a little bit more about these partner choice models. I mean, what are these exactly, and what aspects of human cooperation, human sociality more generally, I guess, can we learn from them? Can we learn about from them?
Yeah, so partner choice models I would call sort of a broad sort of set of models in which the mechanism to getting people to cooperate is this sort of competition to be seen as a good cooperator. So this issue of reputation. So in partner choice models, the idea is that the organism, humans in this context, have the ability to choose social partners, and that these will be moderately to long-term social partners. These aren't one-off kind of interactions, and that other people will know how you're interacting as well. And so the idea is that if you know how I'm cooperating with another person, right? So if you know if I'm being selfish or generous with them, then that will affect how you'll be as a cooperative partner to me, whether you'll choose to cooperate with me. Um, and so if you're a very valuable cooperator, either because you yourself cooperate a lot or you have access to lots of resources, if I know you're looking at me, then I'm going to want to be a better cooperator. And so the idea is that this will increase cooperation within the population because there's this pressure to be seen as a good cooperator. I think this, oftentimes these kind of models connect into questions about like friendships. So friendships are one kinds of cooperative partner that people think about a lot. And so if I want to be seen as a good potential friend, what are the traits that I need to display? And one of them tends to be willingness to cooperate with others. So yeah, I would say that I think that's a rough description.
But in terms of partner choice, is it that the criteria people rely on or pay attention to varies from society to society, varies across societies and depends on, I don't know, for example, the ecological conditions people live in or not?
Yeah, so that's a major focus of my previous research with the Hadza. So the way I thought about it is that the value a cooperative partner presents to someone is a function of, are they willing to share what they have, and can they get resources to share with in the first place? And so those will map onto different kinds of specific concepts. So we might use concepts like fairness or generosity to describe willingness to cooperate. I think they all fall under that umbrella roughly. So in most Western sort of samples or industrialized samples that people have studied these sorts of issues, willingness to cooperate is a very important indicator of cooperative value, of the person's value as a cooperative partner. And so people from these populations tend to pay a lot of attention to that. With my research with the Hadza, we're interested in how these food sharing norms might change that, because one effect the food sharing norms has is that it reduces the variance between people in willingness to cooperate. So if there's these strong norms to share food within a camp, then by and large, how people share is going to be determined more by the camp they're in rather than their own individual disposition to cooperate. So we have some evidence from using economic games where, in fact, that's exactly what we find, that it's what camp you're in determines how much you share in these games and not how much you yourself are generally willing to cooperate. And so in this sort of situation where your food's going to be, people are going to share their food regardless, it might be more important in that context to pay attention to, will they bring food back in the first place? And so that's exactly what we found historically with the Hadza. So we'd ask people to rank their campmates on traits like generosity, so how much food are they willing to share, and whether they're how good of a hunter or how good of a gatherer they are. And what we found historically was that the Hadza who were ranked higher on productivity, on foraging ability, were usually ranked higher on who people wanted to live with. So if I ranked you as high on being a good hunter, I also ranked you high as someone I wanted to live with, and generosity much less so. And foraging ability was more important, what we found historically.
But when you're studying partner choice, I mean, is genetic relatedness another criterion, or is it that in the context of partner choice, you're you only study cooperation between non-kin?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? How are these mechanisms interacting? I think the focus for researchers on partner choice models in general tends to be non-kin, because kin selection usually explains it. But yeah, it's a good question, because in many populations, you can interact with, you have lots of kin available to you that you can interact with, and especially among the Hadza, who are more related to their average social partner than you or I, but it's still actually fairly low within camps. In that context, how is kinship playing a role? What we found was people slightly prefer to live more with their kin, and some previous studies have shown that. But the larger factor was, are you a good hunter or are you a good gatherer? Yeah.
Yeah, I've also asked you that because even if people are keen, it doesn't seem that it's always the case that their interests are aligned, right? And so it could possibly be that not all people that are part of our kin, we would consider them to be potential partners, at least for certain activities, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So kinship creates some aligned interests because of genetic relatedness, but there's often many times where that will compete. So
Yeah.
the classic example, I think, would be like Triver's maternal conflict, right? So mothers also have interests in future offspring, and so they want to cut off weaning earlier than the infant or toddler who wants to continue and cares a little less about their sibling to their own interest. And so, yeah, you'll get conflict there. But yeah, you can imagine conflict in other cooperative contexts where there might be competition between kin because of some institutional structure. So I think that's an interesting question. Among the Hadza, there's not many specific examples where that kind of conflict comes up. I think it's just more that foraging ability just was more important than whether or not they were kin per se. I mean, there are a couple of kin relationships that are particularly important. Siblings tend to be one, and cousins, parallel cousins. So those are also important. But in our data, we find that foraging ability sort of trumped everything else.
Right. So in your work, I read about the anomalous-is-bad stereotype. So what is this, and do you know if it's a human universal?
Yeah. So the question of partner choice raises this issue of how do we learn about who's good cooperators and who's not. And one idea is we can learn about this from how people look. And so there's a lot of work on, sometimes it's called the halo effect or the beauty is good stereotype, where people who appear more conventionally attractive, they have lower asymmetry in their faces, more average faces, people tend to think of them to be better people, more moral, sometimes some evidence that they're viewed as more competent. The anomalous-is-bad stereotype is largely, this work was largely driven by Cliff Workman. He's a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. He's interested in sort of the opposite direction, whereas there are people who have sort of large deviations from conventional attractiveness. They have craniofacial anomalies, so things like facial scarring, burning, cleft palates. There's a lot of research showing that they have, a negative effect. So people perceive them as less moral or less competent. You see this a lot in our own media. So people will often portray villains as, with physical disfigurements of some sort. And so there's this stereotype that people with these anomalies are bad. And as I brought up, a lot of it's in our media. And so there's a good question to be asked about, what direction is that going? Is that culture influencing that stereotype, or is that stereotype influencing the media? So one way we wanted to get at this was to ask the Hadza about this. So they have less access to Western media. I don't want to say they have no access, but they have less access. And just in general, again, we wanted to see, do they have the same stereotype? So what we did was we create these face sets from average Hadza faces, so that way they can't recognize them as people they know, and Photoshop a scar on one of the faces, and we'd present it to the Hadza and ask them, which of these two people, the one with the scar or the one without the scar, has a better heart, is more moral? or is a better hunter or a better gatherer. And what we found was that as a population, by and large, there wasn't much of an effect. They didn't show a strong preference either way. But when we started to break it down by who had more exposure to outside populations, so the Hadza are increasingly interacting with tourists, missionaries, researchers. There's more villages popping up around them. And so some of them are interacting more with non-Hadza than others. And what we found was that those who had minimal interactions with non-Hadza, they spoke very little Swahili, they hadn't gone to school, always lived in the bush, they showed absolutely no preference for choosing the scarred or non-scarred face. But as the Hadza with greater exposure, those who were working jobs for money, they were visiting towns, they had a lot of interactions with outside populations, those people started showing a preference such that they were more likely to pick the non-scarred face as being the more moral person. So they showed the anomalous-is-bad stereotype. Compared to the foraging ability, though, they actually chose the face with the scar. So they actually showed an anomalous-is-good stereotype there. And so to get to your question, is it universal? I think this would be evidence against that, at least. So we find both between populations, that is the Hadza in general, don't show this stereotype, but even within the population, we see variance on the stereotype, and we see that it's not always anomalous is bad, that in fact anomalous can be good, particularly in the foraging context. So by and large, I would say that'd be evidence against it being universal.
Mm-hmm. So moral character is another thing people pay attention to when choosing partners, correct?
Yeah, so here, we've previously found that their concept of moral character in terms of what makes a good person doesn't differ too much. So things like generosity, do you work hard, are you honest, all relate to sort of a global moral character judgment. So we used that global moral character judgment because we couldn't ask about each specific trait. But yeah, so it would relate to how generous they're thought of or how honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this gets us to a question I wanted to ask you that I think also connects, at least in part, to the Geography of Philosophy project. I mean, I've already had, for example, Dr. Clark Barrett on the show, and we talked a little bit about that. So when it comes to morality and what people prefer in terms of, let's say, as the philosophers say, meta-ethics. I mean, are there universal trends, like, for example, do people prefer consequentialists, deontologists? I mean, is there anything like that in terms of trends?
So it's interesting you bring up the consequentialists and sort of deontologists. So, right, one big question in metaethics is, are people utilitarians or consequentialists? That is, they pay attention to the consequences of the outcome of the action, or are they deontologists or non-consequentialists? They pay, rather than paying attention to the outcomes, they pay attention to the rules of the action.
Mm-hmm.
So the classic example is often the trolley problem, right? So
Yeah.
a trolley's hurtling towards 5 people. You can flip the switch to switch to the other track, but there's another person. So would you kill one person to save 5? A lot of work has shown that many societies often are very deontological, where they think the rules matter more than the outcomes. They think it's
Okay.
bad to kill one person to save 5. And there's a lot of great work, a lot of it done by Jim Everett, showing that people think that those who endorse deontology or non-consequentialists are better cooperators. They're better cooperative partners. And the idea is that that preference for non-consequentialists as cooperative partners is what makes people non-consequentialists. That is, because there's a reputational penalty to being a utilitarian, people are sort of pushed to be more deontological. However, again, most of that evidence, like most of psychological evidence, comes from largely Western and industrialized populations. There's a couple of previous examples in small-scale societies. So Jeremy Koster has some work with horticulturalists from Nicaragua, where he shows that they're actually very utilitarian. There's some other evidence from Papua New Guinea where they're even more deontological though than industrialized society. So there's sort of mixed evidence whether or not small scale societies are non-consequentialists or consequentialists. So I ran a study with the Hadza sort of to get at this, where we presented these stories. So they don't know what trolleys are, so we can't use trolleys. So we use questions like, you have food that you're promised to bring back to a friend, and on your way to your friend, or this is third party. So someone is bringing food back to a friend. They come across 5 starving Hadza. He can give the food to the 5 starving Hadza and let the person he promised to give food back to die, or he can let the 5 starve to death and bring the food back to his friend who he promised it to. So again, facing that sort of dilemma, which kill one person to save 5. And what we found was that by and large, the Hadza didn't have a strong preference. They didn't think they're about 50-50 on whether or not people should kill one person to save 5 or not. But what we also found was that they also didn't have a strong preference as social partners. So we also asked them afterwards, if the person killed one to save 5, would you share with him? Is he a good person? Or, if he didn't do that, is he a good person? And what we found was that regardless of the action, Hadza were willing to share with him and think he was a good person. They'd want to live with him. And so we found that they didn't really have a preference for social partners that were non-deontologists or utilitarians, which we suggest, in the same way that there's a link in industrialized populations where this preference for non-consequentialists as social partners pushes people to be non-consequentialists. Once you remove that pressure, like with the Hadza, then you also then see that they are also not showing that preference for endorsing deontology versus utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm. But apart from that last point you just mentioned, do you have any idea of what might be or could be the factors that influence this preference for deontology, consequentialism, potentially virtue ethics? I don't know. I mean, are there any studied environmental factors like, for example, ecological, social, economic, political, that push toward a particular social preference for an ethical system?
Yeah, so there's one large global study. This was with online participants in many countries. I forget how many. It was people signed up onto the survey where they were presented these trolley problems. And what the researchers found was that relational mobility, so how easy it is to switch social partners, predicted how much a country would be deontological versus non-consequent or utilitarian in their decisions. Now, some follow-up analyses suggested that might not be the case once you adjust for certain factors, mostly how similar the countries are. But that's one possibility people have been exploring. And so the study I talked with you about, the Hadza, is sort of like a case study in that sort of where they have specific social partner preferences. Again, they have more preferences for better foragers than more generous people, which might affect also, the preferences for meta ethics. But I think right now there's still a lot of work to be done just to see how much does this vary, and then maybe start mapping it out a bit more on ecological or cultural variables.
Mm-hmm. So, by studying the Hadza, what would you say were the main lessons you got from them in terms of human cooperation?
Yeah, I think my earlier discussion about my own personal sort of intellectual journey of not thinking about the evolution of cooperation, but thinking more about context. I think hopefully they're not recorded, but there's probably some couple earlier talks where I might have made a strong claim where this disproves partner choice models, the fact that partner choice doesn't seem to work among the Hadza, and I think that's silly of me to think that, because there's plenty of evidence that these partner choice models do a lot of good explanatory work in other populations. And so for me, I think the lesson I've learned from the Hadza, and perhaps more broadly, is that we need to understand humans in the particular context that they're in. And so a question like, how does cooperation evolve, again, I think it's better understood as how does cooperation work within this population. So I think that's the main takeaway I took from the Hadza is, understanding the variation humans can display and understanding it in that particular setting.
Yeah. So tell us now about the society or societies you're studying in Tanzania. I mean, first of all, what kind of societies are we talking about here? Are they also hunter-gatherers?
Yeah, so I'm doing this collaborating with Ann Pisor and Monique Borgerhoff Mulder on this project, working with fishers along the coast of Tanzania, so along the Western Indian Ocean, mostly concentrated in the northern Tonga region. So these are people living in villages whose primary subsistence is usually coming from fishing. There's some small scale farming. Most of it is all small scale and subsistence. They're not usually making a lot of money. It's usually just to feed themselves and their family.
Yeah.
Um,
No, and I mean, okay, so with that in mind, what are the aspects of their, for example, economy that you focus the most on to study, particularly long distance relationships and how they develop?
yeah, so the major research question that we're addressing while working with this population is natural resource management. Specifically, how can we get communities to work together to manage shared natural resources? So there's a big emphasis in a lot of conservation work to empower communities to manage their own resources. The issue is that a lot of times the one community doesn't access one resource. So for example, fishing grounds are accessed by multiple villages, 7, 8, however many. And so you can't just work with a village to get them to manage the resource sustainably. You have to get them to work together to manage the resource, all the villages who are accessing it. And so the question is, how do you scale up collective action between communities? And what our hypothesis is that one way to create cooperation in general is to create fitness interdependence. So if our outcomes are correlated in some way, so if by you doing better, I do better, then that makes me invested in how you're going to be infected by my actions. And so we think this principle applies between communities. So if I have an important relationship in a village across the bay that's also accessing the fishery, then my actions to sustainably manage that fishery are also going to affect you. So if I overuse the fishery, I'm hurting people I care about who also, again, have a vested interest in me. Whereas if I, work to manage sustainably, I report illegal fishing, I help clean the beach, that's going to positively affect people that will have a positive effect back on me is the idea. So long distance relationships might be one way that NGOs can sort of target to scale up collective action by sort of emphasizing these long distance relationships can get people to participate more in these large scale collective action activities.
But people from different villages, are they necessarily from different tribes or not?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. It's something Anne's been doing a lot of work on long distance relationships, and she really started with between group relationships, because oftentimes when you go across distances, you're often crossing ethnic groups. In this particular context, I don't think it really applies. So Tanzania is fairly well known for de-emphasizing sort of tribal affiliations. So in national surveys, when Tanzanians are asked to identify themselves, I think like 97% of them, the first thing they say is "I'm Tanzanian."
Okay.
When I'm interviewing them, that's often what they'll say. They say I'm Tanzanian, or we ask like, "Why would you help someone else?" Well, oh, they're a fellow Tanzanian. That's what we do. There are different tribes in some parts. And maybe that can affect it, but mostly in the villages we're studying, they're usually within the same tribal group, so that isn't really a factor here. But you could imagine in other populations, and this does exist, where those long distance relationships may also play a role in thinking about sort of interethnic conflict and cooperation, because again, it's relationships also crossing group boundaries. But here, it's mostly community and distance boundaries.
But in order to develop and maintain these interdependence, I mean, does it also entail, for example, intermarriages or something like that?
Yeah, so that's I think one of the classic examples of long distance relationships is that often you'll see marriage partners going long distances. That happens here. Another source of long distance relationships in this context is fishers are mobile. So, fishing grounds have seasonal productivity, so they often have to move to other villages for half the year to fish and have access. And so this need to travel in order to access the resources they need often creates long distance relationships. So this is largely a Muslim population, so they can practice polygyny. And so what often happens is that we'll interview people and they'll say they have basically two homes. Well, they'll have a home in village A that they spend one season in, and they have a family there and a marriage partner. And then another village where they also have another home, another wife, that they'll spend half the year in. And so these sorts of networks can create lots of connecting long distance relationships. Trade is another one. So we're not just talking to fishers, but we're also talking to people who are buying and selling fish. And so oftentimes they'll buy fish from one village, and they'll go to another to sell it. And so again, they're forming these connections. They're talking with people while they're there, and they're connecting people to other people, right? So there's this network of connections between people, between villages, and there's been work to show that those connections are really important to how Tanzanians react and respond to natural disasters. So people with more network ties outside of their village recover better from extreme rain events, whether that's drought or flood. So these relationships play a very important role in their lives and how they manage risk. And we think that importance of long distance relationships is what we can target to encourage greater cooperation between villages.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything like food sharing between people from different villages, for example? Because that's a thing that we see in several traditional societies, right? And something that also promotes cooperation and fosters relationships.
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe it's because I also think of it as in a Hadza context that food sharing has a particular meaning for how I think about it. They are helping each other in different ways. So there is some food sharing. None of it's obligatory in the same way with the Hadza, where like if you have more than everyone else, you have to share. But there is a general expectation. If you have a couple extra thousand shillings, that's like an extra dollar or so, and someone asks for a little bit of money, you're sort of expected to give it. And what we found, so we did ask specifically about how people were helping their friends within the village and friends who are living in a different village. And what we found was that largely that help is similar. Close distance friends help help each other the same way that long distance friends help each other. One interesting difference we found was that long distance friends were less likely to provide loans to each other. But when they did provide loans, they were often providing loans for capital investment. So to buy a bigger boat, buy better fishing gear. And these loans tended to be larger. So these long distance relationships, not only are they a way for them to access risk, so they can call on their friends to help them, but they're also a way to access resources that might not be available in the village. So if they wanted to buy a new boat, oftentimes there's just not enough cash in one village to buy a boat. And so they have to reach out to their friends in other villages to sort of pull all the cash together in order to buy that boat. So long distance friends help manage risk, and they help access more resources that might not be in the local environment.
Mm-hmm. Do these people that establish relationships with people from other villages use kin terminology to refer to them?
Sometimes. This is very early and ongoing work. So we did notice in some interviews, people would use, they refer to them as sister or brother. There was nothing patterned in what I was seeing, again, 4 months in that particular field context. So I reserve the right to change this after future research.
Yeah.
So nothing. So there weren't. I guess what I say is there was no special terms for long distance friends. So So there's other groups like the Maasai, who are also in Tanzania, who have what's called the Osotwa relationship, which literally translates in their language to umbilical cord. And this is often a long distance relationship that's important for them to manage risk. As far as I could tell within this context, they didn't have that same kind of special ritual relationships, what we'd call it, a special term for these kinds of relationships. They would use fictive kin occasionally, but again, nothing patterned. It's an interesting question, exactly how fictive kin maps onto these sorts of cooperative relationships. There's a lot of interesting research on that, and something, hopefully you can explore a bit more in future field seasons there.
Yeah, I was just trying to break down perhaps all of the different means they might use to promote cooperation, particularly with people from different villages. I mean, another thing that sometimes also pops up in anthropology, do they have, for example, common rituals they participate in?
Yeah, so they're again, they're primarily a Muslim population. I think in our sample, about 95% of them were Sunni Muslim. So they will attend mosque together sometimes. So the smaller villages will share mosques, or they'll share schools or hospitals. So they're having to access these same institutions. But in larger villages, they'll have their own mosque. So that's, there's still that religious affiliation, and we do see that can increase cooperation, but they're not necessarily practicing weekly or daily rituals together. Large religious holidays, they'll come together as villages for larger celebrations. That probably encourages cooperation. Another thing to consider is institutions. So in this context, the reason we're working with this population in particular is that NGOs and the government are starting to implement what are called collaborative fishery management areas, or CFMAs. And so these are specifically institutions that are to sort of coordinate the village level institutions that manage fisheries. So one of the research questions we'll be addressing is, as this institution is implemented, one, what makes them more or less effective are again, people being in villages with lots of long distance relationships. Does that encourage facilitate the CFMAs? And then, sort of the downstream effect, do CFMAs in turn encourage more cooperation? So the, optimistic take, what we're hoping to find, is sort of a bidirectional feedback, right? Where these CFMAs encourage cooperation, and cooperation encourages the CFMAs, and, hopefully as a catalyst to further management.
But at least they tend to have this sort of common identity, right? As you said, at a certain point that at least 97% of them identify themselves as Tanzanians, right?
Exactly. So they have a strong shared identity. So, again, they're traveling between villages too. So one question we were talking with them about was, why do you let people come into your village? Why do you accept them? And how are they different from people who don't live in your village? And what they by and large would say was, well, they're Tanzanians. They're entitled here. One, they're legally entitled. They're legal mechanisms that they're supposed to be allowed to access villages, that they go through the right channels, but also just more sort of traditionally and normatively, they sort of expect that if you come here, and as long as you're not causing trouble, then this can be your home too. So yeah, there's that shared identity is really important in this context.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to go through some of the biggest mechanisms people have at their disposal and that are studied in anthropology to promote cooperation, particularly between groups, and that also show up a lot in the literature of the anthropology of peace systems, for example. I mean, biologically speaking, things like genetic relatedness, but then more culturally, fictive kin, rituals, trade, shared identity, and all of those sorts of things. So I was just trying to understand which of those elements were present in Tanzania. So
I think a lot of them, to varying degrees. Again, a lot of international scholars are often interested in Tanzania because, unlike some other African nations, they don't often have the inter-ethnic conflict. So their neighbor Kenya often has a lot of conflict between two major ethnic groups. But Tanzanians pride themselves, they introduce themselves sometimes as, we're from the country of peace, because even though they have, I think, like 120 different ethno-linguistic groups, it's a very large number. They have very little conflict. There is some. So the Hadza, Maasai, they're marginalized a bit compared to others, but especially along the coast, we asked people what their tribe was, and yeah, they'd say, I'm Wadigo, or that was the predominant one. But it didn't seem to come out beyond that. We had to specifically ask them what tribe you were in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one last topic then, and I think we've already somewhat touched on this, but when it comes to human sociality and morality, the way you look at it, to what extent would you say there are human universals in terms of sociality and morality, and to what extent they vary cross-culturally?
Yeah. In some ways, I think that's a tough question. Depends on what you decide to focus on.
Yeah.
You'll find some things that are universal, right? There's a list of human universals, of the taboos and things that you'll find across societies, and then you'll find a lot of things that are varied or specific to some. I guess how I'll answer this is, I think the important or interesting question is sort of to think about on what level is that varying. So, we could have, and I do think we have a sort of universal pan-human psychology, but that psychology has evolved in a variety of environments and contexts, and is very malleable. And so I think the question that a lot of evolutionary psychologists and cross-cultural psychologists are interested in really is sort of mapping that variation onto sort of universal rules. Can we predict the variation as a function of ecological variables or cultural variables? And so sort of in some ways highlighting the diverse ways humans can behave and operate and interact with one another, but also the sort of universal shared human experience that diversity. So that's my cop out answer, because I think the answer is a lot of universals and a lot of variation. I just think there's an interesting question there about on what level is it varying and what level is it universal.
Yeah, of course, my question was general, but it would be much fairer, I mean, from a scientific perspective, to ask about specific aspects of human sociality and morality, because we would probably have to say different things about each of them. Right.
I mean, you'd probably have to have like a entire podcast channel dedicated to asking human scientists about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, in part, that's what I'm trying to do, so at least in the long term. So, Dr. Smith, just before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Well, I have a personal website, ChristopherMSmith.com, Twitter, Chris_M_Smith. Those are probably the best ways to find me, and I'm always happy to chat to people about humans. I think we're fascinating, and it's always great to talk to other humans about that.
Yeah, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, I had a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, so...
Yeah, I had a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga, Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.